I'd like to discuss histories in the modern era that bind Japan and Korea together. Today, Japan is divided. It's divided about national identity. It's divided Japan versus Japan. Noticeably, one of the ways that this discussion is being debated is by one group attacking, racially slurring, slamming the category of Koreans, both in Japan and Koreans in Korea. Another group is standing up against this with anti-Korean campaigns. Where does all of this come from and what is it about is a broader picture of being Japanese moving forward in the 21st century with a lot of legacies of the modern era of Japan's occupation of Korea during the first half of the 20th century still in the living present. In Korea, it's less divided about this. The ability for young people to rally around anti-Japanese sentiment comes out onto the streets in ways that would seem rather alarming if one didn't know how deeply Japanese music and popular culture permeated Korean music and popular culture, and how much social interaction there can be between Japanese and Korean citizens, both in terms of cultural exchange, academic exchange, pure travel interest. But the question is, in Seoul, why is it so simple on the surface to hate Japan as a category? And in Japan, what is this division stemming from, and what does it really say about society today? In 1942, Japan had a vast empire which covered most of the Pacific and much of the North Asian continent and into Southeast Asia. Korea was at the center of this as one of the most penetrated of colonies, the one tied tightest to the Japanese homeland. The colonization of Korea itself, with 1905 to 1945, had been, in the first half of this era, very militaristic, a takeover of land, governance, economy, the people of Korea. There was a short resistance war, but in essence, there was no possibility that Koreans could withstand the invasion and takeover of their country, if for no other reason that it's almost at the same historical juncture that Japan takes over Korea, that Koreans themselves are developing a sense of national togetherness. That is to say, people who inhabit the Korean peninsula that today are called Koreans were at the time in the late 19th, early 20th century just using those words and concepts for themselves for the first time. This confronted the politics, the power of empire, and Japan and the young Japanese government that had recently revolutionized had determined for Japanese policy to become itself an imperialist. They were able to do this with the backing of England and the United States, both of which welcomed Japan's takeover of Korea in 1905, the full annexation in 1910. The first decade of the first 15 years of Japanese control was absolutely restrictive. The resistance war notwithstanding, it was very difficult for Koreans to protest, to resist the takeover of their country. When an emperor, a former emperor of Korea, died in 1919, the Japanese colonial government recognized that allowing a funeral was likely in its interests. Now, this coincided not unimportantly with notions following World War I of self-governance. The Wilsonian understandings of self-determination were lighting fire under the hearts and minds of young Koreans who ran with these ideas of self-determination. The trick was how to take this to the streets. It became known that the Japanese government had allowed a funeral procession to take place. Young independence activists, as they were called, used this moment in a whole-scale, what would become a nationwide uprising against Japanese colonial control. It is known as the March 1st Independence Movement. The crackdown on the protesters was severe. People to this day dispute the number of those incarcerated and tortured to death, and this becomes a focal point for Korean national identity today. March 1st, 1919 is very much celebrated as a day in Seoul and throughout Korea as national being. Now, the reaction internationally to Japan's crackdown on Korea was quite severe and negative, and the Japanese government worried that the foreign powers that had colonial interests in China and also in Southeast Asia would look negatively on Japan's control of Korea. And so what today historians describe as the age of military rule versus the age of cultural rule was actually a historiographical distinction made in the wake of the 1919 movement. And so it's the first section, the first half of the colonial era in Korea that is described as military rule, the second half as cultural rule, because the Japanese government realized that it needed a broader assimilation approach, a cultural approach, rather than just whole-scale militarization of its colony in order to gain the approval of the world powers. The Naisen Itai policy of homeland and Korea together as one was the official designation, the official policy of this second half of the colonial era. During this time, however, a different kind of violence was visited upon the Korean people, whereby it became possible for Koreans to publish their writings, for example, but largely they were published in Japanese. It became possible to have an identity outside on the streets, but one needed to adopt a Japanese name. So on the surface, assimilation policy sounded magnanimous, but internally it created equal animosities that equally linger to this day. Seoul in the 1930s was renamed Keijo, and it looked by all appearances as a modern bustling city. But again, when you look at this street sign, just one example of many, many, all the signs are written in Japanese. So in the 1930s, it's also important to think and to ask the question, did anybody ever envision this changing? Would the empire not last forever? So then it's important to think, well, if you were a young person in the 1930s, born, you are Korean, would it not be in your interests to learn Japanese? Would it not be something that you would find necessary for your own future? These are very difficult questions to answer. They do tend to lead to us versus them categories of analysis. You didn't resist, you collaborated, you resisted, you collaborated. But again, it's the 1930s, and Seoul is, for all intents and purposes, a Japanized space. Then Japan enters its era of total war. Some measure this as early as 1931, others 1937, but for certain, what is clear is that on the Korean Peninsula, this total war meant the government of Japan's ability to procure labor, both in the form of soldiers who would be soldiers of the Japanese Imperial Army, as well as a category that's been probably receives the greatest amount of international attention, girls and women forced to become what were known by the horrendous euphemism of comfort women to provide aid to Japanese soldiers. And yet what historians have learned is that this was not something as advertised, which was aiding a Japanese soldier. Rather, this was a system of militarized sexual slavery. Korea bore the brunt of this gruesome, horrific history in which 100,000+, some estimate up to 200,000 women and girls from throughout the Empire of Japan were confined into barracks to provide sexual services to Japanese troops. Now, this history also lingers into the present because some of these women survived this horrible, horrible history. And so these are some of the things that before 1945, before what Koreans celebrate as the Day of Light, the day that Emperor Hirohito surrendered, the day that the colonies, Korea included, were liberated, these other categories, Koreans forced or volunteering for the Japanese military, Koreans forced into the system of military sexual slavery, in the mix of liberation, these people then needed to return to Korea or elsewhere and build lives. While not able to claim histories for themselves right away, the Korean War created an entirely new Korea. In the immediate end of World War II, the United States divided Korea in 1945 into a northern zone and a southern zone. This is something that had no history in the long history of Korea, and rather than a day of total liberation, two Koreas were created, another lingering history that exists to this day, with the country still technically at war and the United States still technically at war with our ally South Korea's adversary North Korea. How does this impact the Japan-Korea memory about the colonial era which immediately preceded it? Well, it means that it's very difficult to celebrate liberation from Japan because that day of liberation was actually deeply tied to the immediate moment in which the nation itself would be divided. As a result of the subsequent years of figuring out how to create a more stable atmosphere in Northeast Asia, colonial animosities lingering, many Japanese wanting to get their property reclaimed. They had built lives in Korea, Koreans feeling robbed. They wanted retribution, they wanted not just retribution, but reparations. And the process of a normalization between Japan and Korea lasted from the early 1950s until 1965. The problem is, at the final moment, it was decided, with American pressure on Japan especially, to normalize with South Korea alone. And many protested this both in Japan and Korea, that not agreeing to a normalization of ties at the time in 1965 with North Korea as well, which had had the same colonial era occupation by Japan, would create an entirely complicated, disingenuous, and deeply infected reality for Northeast Asia. So this is something also that continues to this day, insofar as people living in North Korea had the same histories of occupation by those living in South Korea, and yet have not been able to mediate their concerns with Japan in the same way that South Koreans began to be able to do following 1965's resumption of overt diplomatic ties between the countries. This also created a great problem for those of Korean ethnicity in Japan, because in the wake of the American occupation of Japan in 1952, the Korean War was actively on, and deep suspicions about people of Korean ethnicity who might affiliate with North Korea as communists forced the Japanese government to make Koreans take a stand on which side of Korea they would align with, all while living in Japan. So this took place to roughly 600,000 people, and of whom there's still about 600,000 people. It's changed whether people have gone back to Korea, stayed in Japan, but this category of being Korean in Japan remains, again, what we see today on the streets in Japan of how to position yourself as Japanese. Do we purge these people as foreigners? One group argues, or do we argue against such overt racism as Japanese today? The other group argues, all embodied in or targeting the resident Korean as the locus of discussion. This population chart is rather interesting because it shows the steep rise in Koreans in Japan during the era of total war. These people generally were brought as laborers, both voluntarily and hundreds of thousands against their will as slave laborers in the mines, coal mines in particular, some in the gold mines, also in the munitions factories. The number absolutely precipitously drops in the wake of Japan's total defeat when many Koreans returned to Korea. The same number, as you can see from this chart, the number remains relatively stagnant throughout the post-1945 era. And again, it's in that moment when Koreans in Japan are forced to identify with either North or South, which again is a historical category that didn't exist prior to the American division in 1945 of Korea. Fast forward to the present. How are these lingering problems from the first half of the 20th century, Japan's era of colonization, 1905 to 45, on the streets today? Probably for most people, this is best embodied in the category of the victims of sexual slavery. What is really interesting to understand about this is obviously people knew this history had happened, but it was finding the space to be able to claim this history as a history that had happened on an individual level. The 1965 treaty made it impossible for individuals to bring claims against the Japanese government at the time in the 1960s. 1965, South Korea was under a military dictatorship, and it was not possible for the individual citizen to challenge her or his own government in such a way to bring reparations movements against Japan. The treaty stated that the South Koreans accepted Japan's terms. But this was not the case in the early 1990s when the first victim of the Japan system of military sexual slavery found the space in South Korea's burgeoning democracy movement, in the atmosphere afforded in South Korea in the early 1990s, to come forward and claim this history as her life. She came forward. What's interesting is the Japanese government recognized the reality of this horrible history, worked together with groups in Korea, and came forward with what is known as the Kono Statement. Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono at the time issued this declaration in 1993, which acknowledges this history and acknowledges that this history must never be forgotten and must be taught for future generations, and that some sort of state acknowledgement will come. This is one thing that then afforded all sorts of cultural sharing movements in the 1990s, engagement between politicians, academics, citizens groups, student exchanges, largely culminating, many people see, in the 2002 Shared World Cup. Korea and Japan jointly hosted Asia's first World Cup soccer tournament, and it was a moment in which it was cool to be Korean in Japan, and Korea was openly, tolerating Japanese fans. And when you think about sort of a European version of this, this was definitely a measure of historical reconciliation in progress, not final, but it was cool that Korea did just a little bit better than Japan in the finals. Brazil won, but it was cool that both Japan and Korean teams did well. Again, all of this is the culmination of the 1990s, the combination of democracy movements in the areas of Japan's former empire, the ability to claim histories that were still not acknowledged by the state. this openness gave birth to a new kind of right wing in Japan, which I would argue came about roughly from about 2004 and has gained steadily to the present, targeting immediately Koreans. This is probably the most polite of their signs that I would put on YouTube, but this is the kind of thing that a simple Google search will reveal just open acts of hate speech, and open acts of hate speech, the kind of which have led to physical violence against Koreans in Japan and have created an increasing rather than decreasing sense of animosities among younger generations that don't necessarily want to learn from the histories that happened, but would prefer to use the little history they know as a weapon to position themselves against the other. This is best embodied at present in the debate over how to teach and learn from the history of the comfort women, the so-called comfort women, the victims of militarized sexual slavery of the Japanese Empire. And what's really difficult today to understand is that this history, which Japan acknowledged in 1993, is now again in the crosshairs in diplomatic mediations between the Japanese and Korean governments. So what had been taught in history books in Japan is now taken out of the history books in Japan. What had been something that even Koreans were able to claim for themselves is now something that is back again the subject of government control. All of this is currently embodied in a small bronze statue in downtown Seoul that is known as the Comfort Women statue. It's the representation of a young girl, a teenage girl, who is seen as the typical victim of this grotesque system that many thousands of Korean girls and women were subjected to under Japanese occupation and the era of total war. Koreans today do not want their government to agree to a request by the Japanese government that this statue be taken down, a further attempt at erasure of a known history. And so when one considers the era of cultural sharing, of getting together in the 1990s, culminating in an era of real euphoria with the World Cup the summer of 2002, it's alarming that a history that is known to have happened and that will forever bind Japan and Korea together and into the future is now once again tearing the nations apart. It is interesting to me, moreover, and something that really needs to be studied as much as Japan versus Korea, Japan and Korea, is how this is playing out within Japanese society and within Korean society, so that we see through the histories of Japan and Korea in the early 20th century ways in which respective societies separate of one another now position themselves within those societies. In the mix remains the question of North Korea, which shares many of these histories as well, but has today, by its completely aberrant behavior, become the outlier in the region. Notwithstanding, those earlier histories are still there and very much a reality for North Koreans as well. So there's a lot that will forever link Japan and Korea together in the modern era. The way best to move forward is to acknowledge the reality of these really deeply violent histories earlier in the 20th century, from which to learn and to move forward by acknowledging what victims suffered and make good on the promises made clear in the 1993 Kono Statement, among other statements, to learn from them, to teach future generations in a never again approach, because Japan and Korea will live next door to one another as long as the planet is in its current condition. At the same time, it's vital that Koreans and Japanese can live knowing each other's histories rather than using them against one another.